Welcome. My virtual brief paper is entitled Feeling the Feed, Reflections, or maybe even confessions, of an online teacher on transitioning from threaded discussion to social media. Why feeling the feed? I guess this is because I've only recently realized that immersive and pervasive communications technologies mean that we have to move from a more conscious, in control stance in managing our communications as transactions to more of a flow state where we rely on an intuitive or kind of felt state of knowing where things are at within the virtual community. Why confessions? Well, I guess it's an admission that I'm abandoning some, perhaps not all, of the orthodoxies that are in place about managing discussions in online learning. So, in this presentation, I'll begin with a rough timeline within which the short-lived orthodoxy, that I've called it, has emerged, and also how social media technologies have more recently emerged. I will next describe my experience in a transitional case, which leads to a description of where I'm at now in my efforts to create engaging online learning community in my courses. I'll then share some observations and reflections from the experiences to date, which lead to a conclusion, or really a confession, that I've become somewhat more of a proponent for social media use in online higher education than I would have expected. This timeline I've put up with just approximate dates, and it's available at the time glider URL below. Zooming in on the timeline, ASCII bulletin board system variants predated learning management systems, and they supported early socialization and knowledge organizing on the internet, and thread-based message board structures were part of this. These structures inspired what would later become discussion boards within learning management systems. Looking at the timeline too, we can also notice that the heralded computer-based training movement, where prior to being online we worked at a single workstation and we had an interactive experience for the learner driven by what was on the screen, that started to fade out when we got into Web 1.0 in the discussion forum with the emergence of more constructivist and social learning paradigms. Interesting though that currently some of the new innovations that we're seeing are actually combining some of the best of computer-based interactives, placing them into a social context. I think that Khan Academy is doing quite a lot in this area. So we start to see a widespread use of thread-based discussion forums within LMSs and also as part of listserv strategies, which also integrate with email. And major LMS platforms began to emerge, and in higher education, learning management system confined discussion boards came to be seen as the engine room, if you like, of online learning engagement. However, advocacy of discussion board potential effectiveness is not universally embraced. Many university lecturers testified to experiences where they built it and no one came. Some resorted to making discussion forum participation accessible, and maybe did gain some participation increases from students, but the character of the engagement may have only been compliant and shallow. In response to that, the technological arc was accompanied by the development of an orthodoxy about what practices instigated within an instructional learning design framework might make the discussion board work effectively in support of individual and collective learning, and the emergence of best practice in e-moderating. So much was discussed and explored regarding the impact of social presence, teaching presence in online and other technology-mediated environments. Community of Inquiry framework is presently proving a really fruitful framework for research into online learning. These and other research-supported accounts and strategies around teaching team participation, interaction with students, modeling of desired academic communication styles, and presentation of exemplary curricular artifacts are some of the strategies that are suggested in best practice. The progression of technology has included innovations such as discussion assessment integration, mentioned that above, that assessment uses a strategy for promoting engagement, and delivered other enhancements to support presence monitoring, measuring of discussion activity, ability to organize and search for content generated on the discussion boards. All of these have actually been a real improvement in the efficacy of using simple threads, which might have been to highlight new posts with bold type. Some subtle improvements include placing the discussion forum as part of instructional design paths within the LMS, and also Web 2.0 style influences such as participant photographs and chronological screen feeds, And mentioned just briefly, although I don't know how much it has caught on, maybe a bit more now that we can easily put clips such as YouTube and other platforms up, but synchronously posting audio and video files. And of course, more recently, we've had the emergence of the Web 2.0 and social media. Universities have become more concerned with maintaining enrollments and up their marketing budgets, and I guess employed increasing number of marketing professionals who are conversing with current practices in marketing using social media. We're seeing that the university is jumping first into social media, much more so in the marketing mix area rather than in the instructional area. Connectivity over distances is now perhaps appreciated to a greater degree than asynchronicity. Even though real-time scheduled online meetings have been accommodated by an incredible improvement in bandwidth, device availability, and applications which integrate with LMSs, the real story is not about scheduled episodes as it is about continuous narrative. In fact, rather than a mastery of time through the freedom to combine synchronous and asynchronous exchanges, there seems to be a compression of time. Popular wisdom worships real time by way of multitasking. While we as teachers may be uncomfortable with this milieu, as disruptive to our assumptions of optimal learning behavior, the events are substantive and on the bright side may represent some opportunities for disruptive innovation. So that is the background to the case. Further background is that my own experience with threaded discussion boards within an LMS began as a teacher in the late 1990s, then more extensively through completing an online graduate program in the early 2000s as a student, and since then been intensively involved with LMSs in higher education, including discussion forums, both as an educational or learning designer, curriculum consultant, and academic teaching staff developer, and been active as a teacher throughout. And I'm currently teaching into a large enrollment Bachelor of Business program offered solely online through Open Universities Australia. My experience has included exposure to the major LMSs, including threaded discussion forums, platforms such as WebCT, Blackboard, and Moodle. During that time, my own social activity on the internet has been limited to being sometime contributor to different communities, but mostly a lurker within professional listservs. With regards to social media, I've been engaged, but more passively than actively. I've got a Facebook account, a LinkedIn account, and a Twitter account, and also occasionally author and share something on YouTube. In the OUA program, one unit of study that I'm involved as a convener, entitled Comparative Management, has been taught in 2 back-to-back study periods, which are 13 weeks each, in the Open Universities Australia calendar. This unit I'm also co-teaching with an experienced and decorated university teacher, but it's actually her first experience teaching online. So it's interesting to be able to combine the perspectives of a master teacher from the face-to-face environment and someone who's more experienced in the online environment. And in the first iteration of the unit, we had 240 students enrolled at the start, and we tried to go with a conventional threaded discussion board strategy. Threads for queries about assessment, separate thread envisioned for each of the 6 modules that comprise the unit. In line with recommended practice, in the first module, students were encouraged to do introductory posts and perhaps to comment on a stimulus article which we got from Forbes magazines. It was their rankings of the best countries in which to do business. About 40 of the 240 students eventually posted an intro, but only 6 actually commented on the article. One of the introductory posts by one student did mention that he was setting up a Facebook site and encouraged the other students to join. And it was labeled in Facebook exactly with the same unit code list. After discussion between my co-teacher and myself, it was decided that we would request an invite to join the site too, but we wouldn't actively post to it. We'd just sort of monitor it. Asked the person who'd set us the invite if he minded if we joined as well, and he said yeah, sent us an invite, and we joined the Facebook site. We noted after about 3 weeks that 40 students had joined and about a dozen were fairly active on the Facebook site. In addition to an ongoing thread intended to isolate queries about assessment tasks, the 6-module structure of the 13-week unit included dedicated threads, and they were covering different regions and cultural contexts within which we were discussing comparative management practices. There weren't many posts, But there was a clear pattern of two categories of posts that did emerge. Firstly, a lot of students ignored the thread structures, especially after one of the teaching team joined the thread, and usually the concern of the posts on the content thread turned to technical questions about assessment, even though we had a dedicated assessment thread where those things were supposed to be asked. The second pattern was a little bit more sinister in reflection. It was sometimes angry, and it seemed like it was aimed at raising a mob around whatever issue was being identified. So, if a student picked up an error or something that wasn't clear to them, they would be accusatory rather than consultative. And so, the dates given here and there do not match. Instead of requesting clarification by referring to the information given, the mob raising posts were worded along the lines of, hey, is there anyone else having a hard time understanding what is required? We also thought that perhaps this could border on even a sort of a cyberbullying kind of behavior. And it's interesting to see that some are actually currently writing about the phenomena of cyberbullying in online learning. We felt that they were sometimes bullying us to coerce capitulation or some way to illuminate the easiest pathway to completing the required work. Which is fair enough, I guess, in some respects from a student's perspective. Although participation wasn't assessed, a specific engagement plan with a dedicated threaded forum was to give the students a high-quality interactive experience in preparing for the major written assessment task. And it was based on interpreting the assessment criteria. Would supply an exemplar paper, which we created and attached to the main thread. And each of the 4 criteria contained were for marking were posted as separate threads. And the idea was that students would read the exemplar paper and then post their opinion as to what performance level from the descriptors given in the criteria was achieved and perhaps why they assigned it that mark. And then we thought we'd do a little bit of reality entertainment and have a big reveal of the actual mark from the instructor. As soon as we got 50 votes, we were ambitious that we might get 50 votes. We also, after not getting much traction with the postings, we thought, okay, we'll try another tool which we can embed within the LMS called JPoll, which is an in-house polling tool, and see if we could get some responses on that. As the assignment due date approached, the number of students actually posting or voting via JPoll was so minimal, and some of the stats for the posts that we had on our discussion forum are shown here on this slide. We didn't know how, we hadn't set to record view frequencies, but it was pretty dismal. And most of the people that did post didn't actually hazard a vote. So we're really despondent about the lack of engagement. At the same time, we'd been using Yammer organizationally with some of the more people around the university. I recalled that it had a pretty simple, easy to use poll function and wondered whether a social media platform with a Facebook-like interface would garner more attention from the students. Didn't want to go to Facebook necessarily because of Yammer we can control access by email domain, which means that we can protect student privacy and those kinds of issues. And so what we thought we'd do is try and run this exemplar activity optionally on Yammer for those that wanted to engage with it, but we'd still run it concurrently in the discussion forum. And so we extended the date of the exercise and the date of the assignment being due. Within a week after setting up Yammer, we had another 28 votes on each of the criteria. And we did have some discourse and elaboration on the questions and opportunities to discuss with students about the required qualities of achievement and the rationale behind them. We had 2 students who said they'd much rather the discussion forum. There were a lot of positive comments about the Yammer interface and being Facebook-like and better than the LMS discussion forum. Students actually said that they were familiar with Yammer because they used it in their workplaces. Total number of network members in the short window of time peaked at 101, which we sensed was a much higher number than what we were getting people even looking at the discussion forum. From an instructor point of view, it was noticed that maintaining awareness and accessing the platform to see the interactions was much more fluid and would take a lot less time than suiting up, putting on the helmet and the armor, and going in to see if there's something going on in the discussion forum. Odds are nothing's happening. Occasionally all hell breaks loose, but with Yammer we found that you could just look at the dashboard level of the screen, see if something was happening or not. If something's happening, you can go in. Also being able to access it on different devices as well as logging in on the PC. Based on the experience of using both the discussion forum and Yammer platform side by side, in the current study period, using Yammer exclusively for discussion activities. I'm actually convening or co-convening 3 different courses where I'm using Yammer. I also got a couple of colleagues that are also trialing the use of Yammer this study period. I do have other colleagues that are also using Twitter and Facebook, so we're comparing notes all the way along. So the reason we decided this was that after further investigation and considering the access and privacy issues, Yammer has some advantages, particularly for the more technologically savvy students, as it is available to run on a browser. It also has apps for iOS, Android, and PC desktop, both for monitoring and participation. In terms of the privacy, Yammer is secure. If we have access to private groups and networks, that can be nested under the networks, and access is controlled by invitation for the network administrator or instructor. We can make sure that students are using their university email addresses. In terms of access and integration with the LMS, we're still perfecting it, but there is an embed feed widget which allows you to display the private group feed within the LMS page. And we've had some students that are in some of these courses that were in the original comparative management cohort, so that's helped the adoption a little bit. Oh, what did we learn? Sort of a few different categories. There's observation about differences between the technology interfaces of social media and the traditional LMS discussion board forum. There's difference in student behaviors. There's differences in some of the pedagogical assumptions and practices, and there's difference in the actual work practices. So I'll go through each of these overview. In terms of difference between the legacy platform and the social media platform is that in sports we call it playing the man and not the ball. People really will ignore if you try to set up any kind of structure. They'll jump on when they see a person they want to talk to. That behavior actually carries over and disrupts and mitigates against the success of the traditional threaded discussion strategy when you're using a discussion forum. Students that don't use social media are just unhappy because I don't think they're getting enough engagement from their point of view from the teaching team or other students, and the students that do post, they're not posting properly, as it were. Also, there's some search functions on the legacy discussion forum, but the searching is a little bit awkward, and compared to the speed of searching on the social media application, it's very, very slow. Still nutting out how to do user management, access, and security, but that was one of the reasons we went with Yammer instead of Facebook. We definitely need, and we're working on for future study periods, a user guide, because some students aren't very comfortable with social media yet, although many are. Students' behavior. Again, playing the man, not the ball, in terms of posting on the person rather than the topic. The facilitator, this is a headache, because you basically end up doing lots of clicking and going in and back. Sometimes you'll go out and find an answer, and you've got to come back and remember where you were trying to answer to, and it just creates a feeling of greater workload anyway from the facilitator's point of view. And also, if you're not keeping a social presence up, even though it's more difficult to do so on the legacy discussion forum, you pay the price, because you get that mob mentality happening, and so that can get out of control very quickly when you don't respond immediately. So you're feeling that sort of spiraling pressure to actually be online all the time, and it does wear you down. Mention searching. Probably got to do some work with making students aware of that, because they tend to ask questions before they actually search. I think that's something that we'll put in the student guide, is to show them exactly how to do the searching in Yammer, and also perhaps make them aware. I don't think they realize how many students are actually enrolled in these large enrollment courses, and realize that we can make them somewhat sympathetic. They may understand that too. This is an interesting one that is really a big learning for me. I used to think of things like polls and likes as being very superficial, but they're actually more powerful than I thought. Because during the case experience, what I realized is that I can create an ongoing social presence, even though it's not as deep maybe as it needs to be, but I can actually just use likes myself. Also, students using likes, I know that they're at least engaged, even if they're multitasking at the same time. But I thought they were not critical and that they were, I was quite skeptical of things like likes and polls, but now I'm seeing them as a means to create some presence. Pedagogy, I think that you need to bear in mind, particularly in business, but I think in other disciplines as well, that social media will find its way. Yammer's probably an early example of that. And although it's been seen negatively by a lot of employees, they are using it for marketing, and they will be using it more for virtual collaborative work across organizations and between organizations and to support customers. So I think that it's actually a skill that in itself that we need not neglect with our students. Also, one of the common orthodoxies is set up a separate thread about technical assessment questions. And I think that is actually problematic because I really think that problematic in two ways is you need to have assessment, I think, at the center of your pedagogy and having discussions around that because that will be more engaging to students. So to try and disengage the assessment from the topic, somewhat problematic. The other thing is that students aren't going to go to a separate assessment thread anyway, any longer. So I think if it's aligned to everything within the total learning design, rather than trying to say that you can actually unpack it, the assessment part from the other parts of the content, that can be problematic. Lots of observations about teaching work practices, and probably I guess that's the biggest barrier to our adoption of this because it is a big change. Really have only recently started using mobile apps and devices, and so I've got an iPad, I've got an Android smartphone, and I'm getting a better sense of how I can use those devices to feel in touch with things and to actually plan my time better. So knowing what this current state of things is, I can then prioritize whether I've got to go log in and do some heavy lifting or whether things are just cooking along nicely and I can concentrate on other things, particularly when you've got an academic workload where you're doing lots of things besides teaching. I think this is valuable if you can learn to balance it in the right way. Working with a desktop LMS discussion forum, like I said, I think I mentioned earlier, you have to set aside separate time for discussion, monitoring, and facilitation. I have to gear up and go in, and there may be something happening or all hell might be breaking loose. So, although we do have some email notification systems available, but you still have to log in to respond. As in the experience of working with students via the Yammer application, I can continuously monitor, I can see the dashboard level graphical notifications, and something's not a big deal, but I just want to let students know that hey, I'm around. I just hit the like, and they know that I've got just some validation, even if it's a very shallow form, but it can keep them going. I think that a lot easier for me because it's particularly this study period, we brought in some other teaching team members onto Yammer to support the student interactions. And what we're seeing is that you also not only keep tabs on the students, but you can also have more visibility and be more supportive to your teaching team members. So if it's quite easy to do a private message very quickly within Yammer if you want to clarify something and say, hey, this isn't exactly what the assessment's about, so when you're responding to the students, focus on this more and this a little less. Or if they've said something to the students, you can quickly show the students that, yeah, you're right behind the tutor, and you can just hit the like so they know that you've got their back. Email, a lot of the things that we've tried to do with email involve trying to get students to use subject line discipline to tell us what it's about. With Yammer, private messages or posts or even post notifications coming to email, you can immediately see what unit it's in. If you're teaching even different versions of the same unit, one online and one face-to-face, and you get students saying, oh, what's the due date? If the due dates don't line up on the calendars, you're like back to scratch. Well, which cohort are you in, mate? So those kinds of things are useful. There's also, whenever you're trying anything new or you're teaching in a different way than either colleagues or in my case with Open Universities Australia, there's a number of different institutions teaching into the same program. There's issues with consistency and also some of the negative behaviors such as the cyber mobs and the things like that. I think they're actually set up in some cases by previous experience of students where they haven't had a reliable sense that the teaching team was there with them. So that could be part of it. Anyway, that's an overview of my reflections and observations. And where I'm at is after a short but intense time trialing and adapting to use Yammer as a social media tool in multiple large enrollment units of study, I'm really actually seeing a lot more there than I previously thought maybe was a bit of hype and some shallow practices in regards to social media communities in online higher education, and that although this stuff is disruptive, the implementation might be a powerful and useful strategy towards supporting both engagement and my own productivity. And as I said, it's different though, because I'm having to give up that transactional sense of control and try to be in more of a flow state. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering any questions you have on the discussion board, and I've got a couple of questions to pose for you there as well.